We're going to talk about generating ideas through reading and writing, but before we get to that, I want you to think back to when you first decided to apply for and enroll in a doctoral program or other graduate program. What in the world inspired you to do that? My guess is that for most of you, it had to do with wanting to make a difference. Sure, a pay increase is always nice, but ultimately, the only reason to put yourself through all this stuff is because you want to make some difference on the world, either through helping children be more successful, improving the school systems, helping adults with disabilities to be able to interact better with the world. So many different ways, but my guess is somehow you wanted to make a difference. So then the question is how? How is all this work taking these classes, writing a dissertation, how is it helping you make a difference? When we're talking about intellectual work, ultimately, I think that the way we make a difference is through our ideas. It's through the ideas we have that help us look at a situation differently, that helps us come to a new method or approach to something. It's the ideas that are going to make the difference in our world. So we're going to use some quotes here from Stephen King. He wrote a book called On Writing, Memoir of the Craft. And he wrote, "Amateurs sit and wait for inspiration. The rest of us just get up and go to work." If you want to make a difference, ultimately you have to get to work. You see how hard this person's been working with all these ideas they've had to throw out? Yes, it takes a lot of work. And a lot of this work comes down to writing. And we're going to talk about what writing is in a minute. But basically, think of writing as the process of developing ideas, no matter how you're doing it, even if it's just through conversation with someone else. Here's another Stephen King quote. "If you want to be a writer, you must do two things: read a lot and write a lot. There's no way around it, no shortcut." So when we're talking about making a difference with ideas, we have to start with reading. We have to form a foundation, trying to understand what other people in the past have thought, what they've researched and discovered, and really give us some material that we can use to play with, kind of to mold in different ways to see if we can come up with new ways to do things. So reading the existing literature and understanding it is critical. It's the foundation of how you're going to be making a difference. In addition to this reading, you can't just sit back and read and expect that automatically you're going to figure stuff out. You have to be actively working, and this is where writing comes in. And writing, again, it can include note-taking, drawing, discussing, messaging, emailing, collaborating, talking with people. But ultimately, if you develop a consistent habit of sitting down and writing for 10 minutes a day or something, it'll help you keep those ideas moving through your mind so you can start coming up with new ways to make a difference. So we're reading to get some material into our minds to try to understand what others know. And then we're writing to kind of play with those ideas, move them around in different ways, and combine them with our own experiences and see what we come up with. Ultimately, this is going to lead to some questions and connections. And I found a great, probably overused quote about questions, that they're creative acts of intelligence. When your questions are outgrowths of your reading and your writing, they are usually pretty original. They're new ways of looking at something, and they're going to help support continuing this idea of difference and development. Another part of this is connections. When we begin making connections behind ideas, that's when we really pull on the power to see things differently. And that's what a lot of reading does for you as well. It gives you a lot of different ideas you can start making connections between. Of course, just because we have questions and connections doesn't mean that we're done. We have to keep writing. And ultimately, that'll help us form some type of ideas. Now, I describe this in a linear fashion where we go from reading to ideas. In the real world, it's not that clean. It really goes back and forth in different ways, where you might have a question, you might go back to reading a lot more about it, and then you have an idea, and then it brings a question up. Really, it's fluid working around all these areas. Another thing I want to highlight is that when we're talking about writing, it's important to remember that you can also develop ideas through visual and drawing. And I asked you to watch a talk by Punya Mishra where it talked about the visual development of the TPACK framework. And so we're going to talk about that again. But right now, I just want you to understand that writing and development can also come through visual. It can come through doing things and acting. There's a lot of different ways that development happens. Also important to remember is that your research and your practice also impact all of these pieces. In this class, we're focusing on the tree, okay? But as you do your dissertation research, as you do action research projects, these things are also going to be strongly impacted by your research and practice, and it's important to keep that in mind. So I want to talk a little bit about TPACK, and I know you watched a video of it, or you should have by now. So I just want to walk through how that development of TPACK works with this graph that we're showing. So first of all, I want to talk about connections right here. You remember that ultimately, actually I'm not sure if this is the video, Shulman came up with something called pedagogical content knowledge. The teachers need to have knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, content knowledge, and then integrate it for pedagogical content knowledge. Well, Mishra and Keller, with their TPACK framework, all they did is they added technology onto this. And I have a very close relationship actually with Punya Mishra. He was actually my doctoral advisor. And so I've asked him a lot about how this came about. And he said that Shulman was actually at Michigan State University where Mishra and Keller work both. And they've been reading a lot. This PCK idea, it's in the air, and they're working with technology and teacher education researchers and practitioners. So they have all these sources of ideas that are starting to flow through where they're trying to solve this problem of how to help these practitioners, which are mostly teachers, use technology more effectively. Okay, and you might have seen eventually the reason we're using this as a case is because TPACK is very famous. It's one of the most impactful frameworks in technology and education. So you can see here the types of connections they're starting to make between the ideas that are being talked about, and writing is part of discussing that, right? And their own ideas. So then he went through, I'm just going to do this quickly. You see the visual, content, pedagogy, and then they just tried adding technology onto it. They said, okay, there's a problem. They said they tried to represent it different ways. They do some research and that made them take out the representation part of it. But you see here, their research is actually impacting the theory. It's changing their ideas and their questions. So then they were using these visual things and discussing them a lot and writing about them a lot. And they said, oh, we keep drawing this triangle. What in the world do those lines mean? And that is a question to ask. And that helped them start thinking about the circles, that the circles could be knowledge spaces. But then it was still inconsistent because we have a line that's also a type of knowledge and a circle. And that led them to this. And this is the famous figure in 2006 that came out with that really has changed Punya's career and really the field of technology in education. So you see how kind of a lot of the talking and writing they did led to these ideas. Eventually, he added context because of conversations he's had with others. And the button he talked about, there was a random change where they had to put it on a button. And then he made another change just recently in 2018. And this is when I was working with him, where he added contextual knowledge for this circle. And I don't think that's in that video, but there's a link on that blog post to some writing he's done about deciding to talk about contextual knowledge. And that is something that we have continued developing with. So you see how these ideas have come through questions and connections, looking at different things that we've been reading and talking about. And it's not over yet. We're still developing new ideas. For example, what about this ChatGPT thing? Now we're coming into a world where things are different because we have this this AI that is generative and it changes things. And so we can't just stop thinking and say, okay, we're done with all this because we got the theory. We're still reading a lot and writing and discussing these ideas. In fact, you can see here, this is actually just a conversation that we had on Slack. The details aren't important, but this is just a little snippet of a day of talk on July 26th and 24th. We were writing a paper on this. We've had a lot of conversations, a lot of connections and revisions. We submitted a draft and it's still continuing. Okay, and the final version, I'm reviewing the proofs tonight, and hopefully next week it'll be out on the internet to start making a difference with how people are thinking about generative AI and using that to support their students more effectively. So the reason I go through this is I just want you to think about that story using this framework, how ideas develop through work and through relationships and through reading, okay? Now, a few things about writing, and these are writing tips that I think I have developed, I've gotten from other people over time and have really served me well. The first tip is to be consistent. The best way to be a successful writer, which helps you develop the ideas that help you make a difference, is to be consistent. One of the reasons for that is because if you write every day at 7 a.m., 7 to 7:15 a.m., let's say, I write. That makes it automatic, so I don't have to think so hard. And sometimes the scariest moment is just before you start writing. So if you have a consistent routine, it kind of helps you get through that hump. And it also goes down to write even when you don't want to. If you have that consistency in there, you don't have to think so hard about, oh, I can't think of an idea today, I'm going to skip it. You just sit down and do it, and your brain and your body get used to it. Sometimes that means that all you're going to do is pressing random buttons and hoping something coherent comes out. That's okay. There are days that are better than others. You just go with the flow. Sometimes you sit down to write and you say, I don't know what to write about. And then maybe you start talking about a conversation you had with your cat, and then et cetera, et cetera. And it might not ever come to anything useful. But in my experience, more often than not, eventually some of my random typing comes to something careful. And really think carefully about each word before typing it. I don't think you ever want to do that. I don't think that's something you ever, I'm going to cross that out. That's not something you ever want to get to, because that means you're stopping your thought process too much. Another tip is notice when you're distracting yourself. And this is such a common thing that there's so many jokes about it. Okay, I can't avoid this anymore. I've reached the point where I'm going to have to start. I wonder if there's a name for reaching that point. I'll look it up on the internet. Procrastination wins again. I talk to many friends where we say, my house was cleanest when I was trying to write my dissertation. The hardest time for me was when I was writing. You find all these other things to do instead of writing. So you have to learn to just go ahead and do that. And again, that consistency helps. Start with bad drafts. It's fine to have something really bad. That's the whole point. Once you have something down, it'll help you move forward. This is just another little comic about if your writing's going well. Depends on what you mean by writing. I'm topping a lot of words, thinking a lot. If you're considering not writing part of writing, then technically I'm writing a lot. That's not right. Anyway, that's just kind of a funny comic. And then finally, don't be afraid to share. Our work only gets better when we share it with other people. And I think I've shown this comic to you before, but just these ongoing revisions, whenever you submit an article for a journal, it always comes back. I think only once so far in my writing, and I've published about 40 things. I think there's only been once that they've accepted as is. Almost always you have to make changes, but those changes make it better. So, in summary, the whole reason I'm spending all this time talking about writing is because in this class, we're focusing on developing ideas through building on what we're reading. It's easy to get stuck into just reading a lot. We also want to be developing those ideas, and I'm going to be pushing you to do that in this class. Ultimately, we need to share these ideas, whether that's through research, through teaching, through speaking, through publishing. Ultimately, we're going to take these ideas develop, we're going to share them out, and that's how you're going to make a difference as an intellectual.